The air inside the courtroom was thick, almost electric, as though the walls themselves understood that history was about to be made. Judge Richard Leon, a man known for his stern composure and unflappable presence, leaned forward from the bench. For the first time in his long career, his lips parted but no words came out. He was struck into silence. All eyes turned to the woman standing firm at the center of the room, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Her voice had just cut through the oak-paneled chamber like a blade, sharp and undeniable. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't begged. She spoke with a calm that was terrifying in its clarity, and it was that very calmness that froze the entire audience in place. "You don't get to erase my people's sacrifices just because they make you uncomfortable," she declared, each word slow, deliberate, heavy as stone. Gasps rippled across the room. Reporters dropped their pens. One camera shutter clicked too loud in the silence, echoing like a gunshot. The spectators shifted in their seats, caught between disbelief and awe. Some wanted to cheer, others wanted to shrink back, but all of them felt the chill of truth in her words. Judge Leon's eyes flickered, the weight of the moment sinking in. This was no ordinary courtroom defense. This was a woman refusing to bend, refusing to be diminished. Her presence alone seemed to demand that every person listening confront something deeper. The stories buried in America's soil, the sacrifices that paved the way to this very room. The murmurs began, hushed whispers, hands covering mouths, reporters scribbling furiously. Not one had missed a headline that was unfolding before their eyes. And yet, even as the room swirled with shock, Crockett stood unshaken. She let the silence hang, almost daring anyone to break it, daring anyone to dismiss her. Her eyes swept across the benches, pausing just long enough to let the weight of her words sink into every corner of the chamber. The tension was unbearable. What had she just set into motion? What power could be found in words that made even a federal judge lose his breath? The country would soon find out. But first, the confrontation was only beginning. This wasn't just another case. It wasn't another procedural hearing destined to be buried in legal archives. What played out in that courtroom carried the weight of a nation's unfinished battles. Behind the polished mahogany and marble grandeur was a struggle that cut to the heart of America's identity. Who gets to define freedom, and who gets silenced in the process? The stage had been set months before. Challenges to voting rights had been mounting, wrapped in technical legal jargon, but soaked in political consequences. At stake was not just one community's voice, but the very question of whether the Constitution would continue to protect those it was written to safeguard, or whether it would be twisted into a weapon of exclusion. Enter Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't just a congresswoman defending an argument. She was carrying the stories of countless citizens whose voices risked being muted. Every subpoena, every motion, every headline leading to this moment had framed the trial as a showdown between legal technicalities and moral truth. And yet, when she stood before Judge Richard Leon, it became clear this wasn't just about one woman's defense. This was about the future of constitutional accountability. America has always tested its promises. From civil rights marches to courtroom battles, progress has been fragile, often hanging by a single decision, a single interpretation of the law. That's why the stakes here were so high. If Crockett lost, the decision wouldn't just ripple, it would roar, setting a precedent that could weaken protections millions rely on. And if she won, it would remind the country that justice is not static. It evolves through those brave enough to demand it. The tension inside the chamber reflected the divide outside it. Protesters filled the courthouse steps, some chanting for equality, others waving placards that declared opposition in fiery slogans. News outlets called it the case to watch, while politicians across the aisle quietly measured their own futures against its outcome. It was as though all of America's contradictions had been funneled into one room, waiting for the gavel to decide what kind of democracy would emerge. And then came the human element. The fear of being forgotten, the pain of generational erasure. For communities whose rights had always been fragile, this case symbolized survival. It was more than law. It was legacy. And Crockett knew it. That's why her words carried more than strategy. They carried centuries of unacknowledged struggle. When she spoke, she wasn't just addressing Judge Leon. She was speaking to the mothers who marched, the workers who organized, the dreamers who refused to be told no. Her defense was a bridge between the Constitution's text and the blood spilled to make it real. That's why the silence after her statement was so deafening. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was a silence of recognition. Everyone in that room, from the most seasoned reporter to the most casual observer, knew they were witnessing something far bigger than a legal exchange. But to understand why this moment mattered so deeply, you have to know the forces Crockett was up against. Forces that weren't just political opponents, but embodiments of a larger struggle for power and control. Forces that believed democracy could be bent, reshaped, and even betrayed if no one was brave enough to stop them. And in that courtroom, on that day, Jasmine Crockett decided she would be the one. ChatGPT can make mistakes. To understand the intensity of that moment in Judge Leon's courtroom, you have to know who Jasmine Crockett was standing against. Because this wasn't simply a trial of arguments. It was a contest of worldviews, of those who believed power was their birthright, and those who dared to challenge that illusion. The prosecution had come armed with more than legal briefs. They carried with them the full arrogance of establishment entitlement. Men in tailored suits with clipped tones, convinced their pedigree alone guaranteed victory. They didn't just want to win the case. They wanted to humiliate her, to remind her and everyone watching that the system belonged to them. And in many ways, they had history on their side. These were the same forces that had, time and again, bent the law to protect privilege. They were seasoned in courtroom theatrics, skilled at dismissing opponents as naive or ill-prepared. To them, Jasmine Crockett wasn't a threat. She was a disruption, a politician out of her depth, an outsider meddling in what they considered their domain. The arrogance showed in every exchange. When Crockett raised objections, they smirked. When she presented facts, they waved them away with the casual air of men who believed truth was malleable. Reporters noticed it, too. Their condescension wasn't subtle. It was part of performance. Every glare, every chuckle, every exaggerated sigh was designed to send a message. You don't belong here. But arrogance often blinds. And theirs was a long tradition of underestimation. For years, these same figures had brushed off movements that grew into revolutions. They dismissed activists as troublemakers, only to find themselves later facing the tide of history. They mocked calls for equality, then scrambled when courts forced change. The very pattern was repeating itself here, yet they were too confident, too sure of their invincibility, to see it. The hypocrisy was glaring. These were the men who claimed to be defenders of the Constitution, yet they wielded it selectively, like a shield when convenient and a sword when power demanded it. They praised rule of law, but turned a blind eye when that law was twisted to suppress the vulnerable. They spoke of order, while fueling chaos that served their interests. To them, the law wasn't sacred. It was a tool of control. And the media critics? They played their part eagerly. Columnists wrote mocking headlines about Crockett's chances, reducing her to caricatures. Pundits scoffed at her lack of experience in constitutional law. Some even questioned her presence in the courtroom at all, implying that her voice, her perspective, her fight didn't carry the same legitimacy. Their coverage dripped with the same dismissiveness as the prosecution's smirks, amplifying a narrative that this was a battle already decided. But arrogance isn't just an attitude, it's a weakness. And the more the prosecution pressed their attack, the more certain they became of victory. They relished their control of the narrative, reveling in the spotlight of a case the nation was watching. They believed that by sheer weight of tradition and intimidation, Crockett would buckle. What they overlooked was her resolve. They saw only the surface, a congresswoman standing alone in a chamber heavy with history. They didn't see the countless nights she had prepared, the community she carried in her voice, the fire of generations who had been dismissed in the same way. They assumed that by pressing harder, they were crushing her spirit. In reality, they were setting the stage for their own undoing. Every overreach, every display of arrogance, every contradiction in her arguments only made the silence after her words more powerful. What they didn't realize was that their certainty of victory was building a story they could no longer control. They thought they were writing her defeat. In truth, they were sharpening the contrast that would make her defense unforgettable. Because arrogance has a breaking point. And in that courtroom, under the watchful eyes of a nation, it was about to shatter. What they didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett was about to flip the narrative entirely. Before the gavel struck, before the murmurs of the courtroom faded into silence, Jasmine Crockett's journey had already written the prologue to this confrontation. To the prosecution, she was just another politician who had wandered beyond her lane. But to those who knew her story, every second of this trial felt inevitable, because everything she had endured had prepared her for this exact moment. Jasmine's story began far from marble columns and hushed courtrooms. She was raised in a world where dignity wasn't handed to you. It had to be fought for daily. The daughter of hard-working parents, she saw early on what it meant to struggle under a system tilted in favor of others. Bills came late. Opportunities often felt just out of reach. And yet, what her family lacked in privilege, they made up for in resolve. Around the dinner table, she learned that justice wasn't abstract. It was about whether families could live with dignity, whether children could walk into schools without fear, whether voices from her community were heard in places of power. From those roots, she carried an unshakable sense of responsibility. In school, she was underestimated, often written off as too loud, too passionate, or too ambitious. But those labels only hardened her drive. Every dismissive remark became fuel. She went to law school not because it was glamorous, but because she had seen too many people like her silence in legal battles they could not fight alone. While her classmates gravitated toward corporate firms, Jasmine found herself in courtrooms defending those who had nowhere else to turn. Tenants facing eviction, workers cheated out of wages, families torn apart by systemic failures. She stood beside them, even when the odds were impossible. But such a path was never easy. Public service demanded sacrifice. The hours were long, the pay small, and the emotional toll heavy. There were nights she returned home exhausted, questioning whether her fight made any difference at all. There were moments when the weight of injustice felt suffocating, when cynicism threatened to creep in. Yet, every time she saw a client's relief or a family's gratitude, she remembered why she had chosen this life. Dignity mattered. Truth mattered. People mattered. When she entered public office, the scrutiny multiplied. Opponents branded her radical. Pundits painted her as a threat to order. But behind every attack was the same undercurrent. They feared her not because she was weak, but because she carried the credibility of lived experience. She spoke with the clarity of someone who knew what injustice looked like, not from textbooks, but from her own streets. And that credibility came at a cost. She endured hate mail, threats, even attempts to discredit her character. There were sacrifices invisible to cameras. Missed family gatherings, restless nights, the constant awareness that her words might be twisted into weapons. Yet, she never wavered. Because for Jasmine Crockett, service wasn't about ambition. It was about honoring the struggles that shaped her. That's what made this courtroom so symbolic. For her, this wasn't just another legal showdown. This was the arena where all her identities collided. The lawyer who fought for the powerless, the daughter who had grown up knowing what it meant to be dismissed, the Congresswoman carrying the hopes of those rarely invited into rooms of consequence. Every glance from the prosecution, every smirk from the media, echoed the dismissal she had faced her entire life. And every time, she had answered not with rage, but with resolve. The irony was sharp. The very forces trying to discredit her had, in a way, prepared her. They thought they were pushing her into uncharted territory. In reality, this courtroom felt like home. She had spent her life navigating spaces where she wasn't supposed to belong. She knew what it was to be underestimated. She knew the sting of being silenced. And she knew that the only way to answer was not with louder words, but with undeniable truth. The stakes were bigger than her. She carried the weight of her community, the faith of those who believed democracy still had room for people like them. She carried the dignity of immigrants seeking a place to stand, of young girls watching to see if courage could triumph over condescension, of families who prayed that justice was still possible in America. For Jasmine, every word she spoke in that chamber was tethered to something larger than herself. This is why the moment mattered. It wasn't just about a defense strategy. It was about proving that truth, spoken with clarity, could still pierce arrogance. It was about showing that resilience, built over a lifetime of battles, could stand unbroken even in the most intimidating of chambers. The prosecution believed they were fighting a lone Congresswoman. They were wrong. They were fighting some of her experiences, the weight of her sacrifices, the fire of a woman who had lived every contradiction they represented. Every trial she had endured outside that courtroom had prepared her for the trial unfolding within it. And as she rose to speak, all the pieces of her journey seemed to converge. The childhood lessons in dignity, the long nights of service, the countless dismissals that only sharpened her resolve. The silence of the courtroom wasn't just respect. It was recognition, however reluctant, that this woman belonged here. It was in this crucible, under the gaze of skeptics and the shadow of arrogance, that Jasmine Crockett's true power would finally be revealed. The air inside the courtroom had shifted. It was no longer just tense. It was electric, crackling with anticipation as the opposition seized its moment. Their lead attorney rose slowly, a smug grin etched across his face, as if the outcome had already been written. He strutted toward the center of the room, glancing at the press benches, as though performing for the cameras rather than the court. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, drawing out his words with deliberate condescension, "what we have here is nothing more than theatrics. Ms. Crockett's defense is not grounded in law, but in emotion, in spectacle, in the kind of rhetoric meant to distract from the facts." His voice grew louder, more dramatic, each phrase calculated to land like a blow. He jabbed his finger toward her, almost sneering. "She wants you to believe she's some kind of crusader for justice. But the truth? She is reckless, unqualified, and dangerously misguided. This courtroom is not a stage for her personal ambitions." A ripple of murmurs ran through the audience. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, eager for confrontation. Reporters bent over their notepads, pens scratching furiously, eyes flicking between Crockett and her opponent, sensing a headline in the making. And yet, Jasmine Crockett remained motionless. Her posture was steady, her hands folded lightly on the table in front of her. No visible reaction, no rise to the bait. She simply watched. Calm, patient, almost disarmingly still. The prosecution doubled down, mistaking her composure for weakness. "Let's not forget her history," the attorney pressed on, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Her so-called track record is riddled with failures. Cases lost, policies that collapsed under scrutiny. Every time, she blames the system, blames her adversaries, blames anything but herself. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not leadership. That is deflection." Across the aisle, one of the jurors shifted in their seat, brow furrowed. In the gallery, whispers grew louder, some gasping at the personal nature of the attack. The courtroom's atmosphere had morphed into something raw, teetering between outrage and unease. But still, Crockett did not move. She let them talk. She let them stack insult upon insult, accusation upon accusation, weaving a tapestry of arrogance so thick that even neutral observers began to see the cracks. Every sneer, every smirk from prosecution exposed more their own contempt than her supposed flaws. The attorney leaned on a railing, his voice dropping into a mock whisper, as if confiding in the room. "And let's be honest, Ms. Crockett is here today not to defend truth, but to defend herself. Her so-called principles are nothing more than political theater. She thrives on outrage, feeds on division, and if you allow her to continue, you'll find that this courtroom has been reduced to little more than her personal stage." That did it. The audience reacted audibly now, some shaking their heads, others clutching their pearls at the brazenness. Reporters' eyes widened, their pens flying faster across the page. Even Judge Richard Leon raised his brows, leaning forward as if weighing how far the prosecution was willing to push the boundaries of propriety. Through it all, Crockett remained stone-faced, but those close enough could see the subtle flicker in her eyes, not anger, but focus, a calculation, a readiness. The prosecution, emboldened by their own performance, went in for the final strike. "So I ask you, Judge Leon, how long will we allow this charade continue? How long will we indulge the fantasies of someone who cannot separate passion from law, ego from truth? For the sake of this court, for the sake of this country, we must put an end to the Jasmine Crockett show." The words echoed like a slap, bouncing off the marble walls. Silence followed, heavy and unrelenting. Even the air seemed to pause, waiting for what would come next. The smug attorney leaned back, satisfied, certain he had delivered the knockout blow. But then, finally, Crockett moved. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hands on the table and rose to her feet. The scrape of her chair against the floor was barely audible, but it carried like thunder through the hushed chamber. Every head turned. Every reporter froze mid-scribble. Even her opponents fell silent, suddenly realizing that their moment of dominance had been too easy, too unchecked. Crockett leaned forward, steady and unflinching, her eyes locking onto the prosecution with a calm intensity that silenced even the whispers in the gallery. And then, with the entire room watching, Crockett leaned forward and spoke. The silence stretched thin, taut as wire. All eyes were on Jasmine Crockett. She stood there, unhurried, commanding the room not with volume but with presence. The prosecution, flushed with overconfidence just moments ago, shifted uneasily in their seats. Their smirks faltered, though they tried to hold them in place. Reporters stopped scribbling mid-sentence. The tension was unbearable. Every breath in the chamber pulled taut in anticipation. Crockett began softly, her voice low but resonant. Each word measured like the strike of a clock. "You've mistaken my silence for weakness," she said, turning slowly to meet the gaze of the courtroom. "But I was giving you the floor, for everyone to see just how flimsy, how hollow your arguments truly are." The words lingered in the air, heavy. A few murmurs rippled to the gallery, and then faded into breathless stillness again. Crockett stepped forward. She placed a hand on the defense table, steady as stone, her other hand rising to gesture with surgical precision. "You say my defense is built on emotion," she continued, eyes narrowing. "But let's talk about what your case is built on. Not evidence, not constitutional law. No, your case is built on character assassination, smoke, and mirrors. You hoped that if you threw enough mud, some of it would stick." She turned sharply toward the prosecution bench, her tone hardening like tempered steel. "But this courtroom is not a stage for your theatrics. It is a forum of law. And unlike you, I came here armed not with insults, but with truth." Gasps fluttered from the audience. Reporters scribbled furiously now, trying to capture every syllable. Crockett paced slowly, her footsteps echoing lightly against the marble. She reached for a thick folder stacked neatly at her table, flipping it open with deliberate calm. "You question my record," she said, lifting a page. "So, let's talk about record. You cited cases I've lost, conveniently omitting that those same cases later informed policy reforms that protected thousands of ordinary citizens. You call that failure? I call that progress. You call it weakness? I call it the foundation of resilience." She paused, eyes locking with juror who nodded almost imperceptibly, as if drawn into her gravity. "And you question my motives. You say I came here to serve myself. But tell me this, what do I stand to gain? I could have chosen the easy path. I could have stayed quiet, gone along, kept my head down. But I didn't. I stood up because silence in the face of corruption is complicity, and I will never be complicit." Her words landed like hammer blows, echoing through the chamber. Even Judge Richard Leon leaned forward, lips parted slightly, as though forgetting he was the arbiter of the trial. The prosecution shuffled papers nervously, tried to mask their unease. One of them coughed, the sound sharp in the silence. Their arrogance, once so assured, was beginning to fracture. Crockett's voice grew stronger, gaining rhythm, like a conductor leading an orchestra toward crescendo. "You argue that passion has no place in law. But tell me, what is law without passion for justice? What is the Constitution, if not a covenant between principles and people? To defend requires more than cold recitations. It requires courage, humanity, and yes, passion." Her words struck chords deeper than legal technicality. They resonated in the bones of everyone present. Reporters exchanged glances, already sensing history being written in real time. She reached for another document, holding it high. "And as for your so-called evidence," she said, her tone dripping with restrained fire, "let's examine it, line by line, article by article, fact by fact. What followed was a methodical demolition. Crockett dissected their claims with surgical precision, citing statutes, constitutional precedents, historical cases. Every sentence tightened the noose around the prosecution's arguments. Each exhibit she raised, each precedent she invoked, chipped away at their credibility until what seemed like a fortress was exposed as a house of cards. At one point, she turned directly toward Judge Leon, her words slow and deliberate. "This is not merely about me. This is about whether we allow the Constitution to be weaponized for personal vendettas. If we allow this, then no one, not one citizen, not one public servant, will be safe from persecution disguised as justice." The judge blinked, clearly moved, though bound by his duty to remain neutral. The weight of her statement settled heavily in the room. Crockett closed the final folder, placing it on the table with a soft thud that carried more finality than any gavel strike. She let the silence stretch again, letting the prosecution stew in the ruins of their bravado. And then she delivered a line that would be remembered for years. "You thought this was my trial, but in truth, this is yours. You are on trial for your abuse of power, for your contempt of truth, for your betrayal of the very principles you claim to defend. And today, in front of this court, in front of this country, you've been found guilty by your own words." The gallery erupted. Gasps, murmurs, even suppressed applause. The prosecution's lead attorney sat frozen, color draining from his face. The smugness was gone, replaced by something raw, disbelief. His mouth opened, but no words came. Judge Leon's gavel finally cracked against the wood, calling the room to order, though his eyes betrayed awe. It was clear to everyone in the chamber that something seismic had occurred. Crockett, unflinching, delivered the final mic drop. "It wasn't just a defense," she said, her voice calm, resolute. "It was a demolition." The words reverberated like a thunderclap, final and unanswerable. She gathered her papers, stacked them neatly, and sat down with quiet composure. The air still buzzed, the audience still trembling from the force of her words. The prosecution sat in stunned silence, their once dominant posture shattered beyond repair. Reporters scribbled feverishly, already framing their headlines. Crockett turns trial upside down, judge speechless, prosecution in shambles. But as the courtroom slowly returned to order, there was an undercurrent, a sense that the drama was not yet over. The battle inside had been won, but the war outside still raged. Cameras were waiting. Commentators were sharpening their knives. Politicians were circling, and Crockett knew it. She glanced briefly toward the back of the courtroom, where the doors loomed like gateways to another battlefield. The audience could feel it too. This was not the end. It was the ignition point, because the true explosion would come not inside the courtroom, but outside of it. The courtroom's energy still lingered in the air long after the gavel struck. But the real storm was only just beginning, and it was brewing online. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's mic drop demolition, social media exploded. The hashtag Crockett Defense shot to the top of Twitter/X's trending chart, spreading like wildfire across feeds. Clips of her counterattack, cut into 30-second bursts, ricocheted across timelines. The moment she declared, "This is not my trial, it's yours," was replayed, remixed, and looped endlessly, set to dramatic music, slowed down for effect, captioned in bold letters. It wasn't just a legal moment anymore. It was a cultural one. On TikTok, users stitched her speech into motivational montages. College students in dorms shouted her words into camera phones, imitating her stance with mock folders in hand. One viral clip featured a side-by-side edit. Crockett's line, "It wasn't defense, it was a demolition juxtaposed with collapsing buildings and falling dominoes." Memes flooded the internet within hours, painting the prosecution as cartoon villains and Crockett as an unstoppable force of nature. Journalists scrambled to keep up. What had begun as a courtroom drama instantly became the story of the week, eclipsing even political scandals and international headlines. Cable news anchors broke into their programming with breathless coverage. "You have to see this moment," one said, rolling the clip live. Pundits dissected her words line by line, debating whether it was the single greatest courtroom takedown in recent memory. Even critics, those who had spent weeks undermining her credibility, were left stumbling. Their talking points, once sharp, now sounded like excuses. Some downplayed the moment as theatrics. Others clung desperately to technicalities, arguing that a courtroom should not be a stage for passion. But the excuses rang hollow in the tidal wave of public opinion. The more they protested, the weaker they looked, because the people had made their decision. Supporters framed Crockett as a modern icon of justice. Editorials praised her mastery of both law and language, calling her performance a masterclass in constitutional defense. Commentators compared her to past giants of the courtroom, figures whose words had outlived the trials themselves. Artists began sketching portraits of her mid-speech, fist raised slightly, eyes blazing with conviction. On Instagram, inspirational accounts overlaid her quotes on dramatic backgrounds. The Constitution, a blazing sunrise, a courtroom gavel caught in midair. It wasn't just a defense, it was a demolition, became a rallying cry. Printed on T-shirts within 24 hours, adopted as profile bios by thousands. But beyond the memes and the headlines, something deeper pulsed through the reaction. For many ordinary citizens, people who had grown tired of watching power crush dissent, it felt like a shift, a small but undeniable moment when the script flipped. For once, one viral tweet read, "It wasn't the powerful silencing the people. It was the people lifting up one powerful truth." That tweet alone gathered over 500,000 likes, echoing the sentiment of countless others who felt their frustrations articulated in Crockett's words. It wasn't just that she had won in the courtroom. It was that she had spoken with a clarity and defiance that people yearned to hear. By evening, talk shows invited legal experts to weigh in. Some marveled at her precision, noting how she dismantled the prosecution without a single misstep. Others highlighted her ability to bridge law and emotion, a rare fusion that turned dry arguments into living fire. In Washington, whispers spread among politicians. Some, emboldened by her stand, praised her publicly. Others, uneasy about her rising influence, stayed silent or issued carefully worded statements. But silence, too, was a kind of acknowledgement. Everyone had seen the footage. Everyone knew the impact. On college campuses, law students played the clip in lecture halls, professors using it as a case study in rhetoric and constitutional argument. Online forums buzzed with debates about whether this moment marked a turning point in public trust toward the justice system. Meanwhile, Crockett herself remained composed. She gave no fiery interviews, no victory speeches. Instead, she walked out of the courthouse calm, almost serene, as though she understood that the moment had already grown beyond her. Her silence outside contrasted sharply with the uproar inside screens across the nation, making her seem all the more unshakable. The contrast was poetic. While the establishment scrambled for words, the people had already spoken for her. The shock wave spread globally, too. International headlines picked up the story, framing it as an American courtroom drama gone viral. In London, Paris, and beyond, commentators marveled at how a single defense attorney had captured the world's attention with nothing more than conviction and clarity. But with admiration came pressure. As the internet crowned her a symbol, questions loomed. What would she do next? Would she ride this momentum into politics? Would she become the new face of legal reform? Those answers weren't clear. What was clear was that the moment had left an indelible mark. Crockett's counterattack wasn't just an event. It was a spark, a symbol that truth, when spoken with courage, could pierce through the thickest walls of power. And as hashtag Crockett Defense continued to trend, as her words echoed through timelines, group chats, classrooms, and television screens, one reality became undeniable. This was no longer just a trial. It was a turning point. And the aftershocks were only beginning. The roar of the crowd outside, the flood of social media, the endless reels of coverage. These were only the echoes of what had truly happened in that courtroom. Because at its heart, Jasmine Crockett's defense wasn't just about winning an argument, dismantling an opponent, or even silencing critics. It was about something larger, something timeless. The idea that dignity will always outlast arrogance, and truth will always outshine corruption. Her words carried weight because they weren't born of ego. They were born of struggle. She didn't speak as someone shielded by privilege or elevated by entitlement. She spoke as someone who had lived the battles, felt the weight of prejudice, and chosen, time and again, to fight for something greater than herself. In doing so, she transformed what could have been just another courtroom exchange into a universal story of resilience. And that was a lesson people carried with them long after the cameras stopped rolling. The villain's arrogance, his smug smiles, his belittling tone, his carefully rehearsed traps, had seemed unshakable at first. He carried himself like someone who believed power was permanent, like someone convinced that control was by default. But arrogance has cracks, and Crockett exposed them not with rage, not with theatrics, but with quiet, unrelenting dignity. That dignity, calm, rooted, immovable, became her weapon. It disarmed his cruelty, revealed the hollowness beneath his words, and shifted the balance of power. For those watching, it was a revelation. True strength isn't loud. It isn't cruel. It isn't manipulative. True strength is the courage to stand steady when the world tries to break you. Her counterattack didn't just dismantle his case. It reframed the very meaning of justice. She reminded everyone in that chamber, and by extension, everyone watching, that justice is not a game of the powerful. It is a safeguard for the people. It is the promise that even the most underestimated voice has the right to be heard, the right to stand unbroken in the face of intimidation. That is why her words resonated so deeply. They weren't just hers. They belonged to every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or silenced. They belonged to every citizen who had felt powerless in the shadow of systems designed to overwhelm. When she spoke, it was as if she carried their voices with her, lending them dignity through her defiance. And that became the moral lesson of this trial. Her words didn't just defend herself. They defended every American who ever felt voiceless. In the weeks that followed, this lesson rippled far beyond the courtroom. Community leaders invoked her defense in speeches about resilience. Teachers showed clips in classrooms to remind students that intelligence and dignity can cut sharper than cruelty. Families discussed her courage around dinner tables, finding in her story a reassurance that truth does not need to shout in order to be heard. The broader message was unmistakable. Democracy is not maintained by those who cling to power. It is sustained by those who refuse to surrender to it. Justice is not defined by the intimidation of the strong, but by the courage of the steadfast. For every person watching, whether a young student learning about the Constitution, a weary worker feeling unheard in their job, or a voter cynical about politics, the takeaway was clear. Your voice matters. You may not always hold a microphone, but when you stand with dignity, when you hold fast to truth, you carry a power that cannot be silenced. This was why Crockett's moment transcended the trial. It became a mirror reflecting the broader values America claims to uphold: fairness, equality, justice. In her defiance, people glimpsed the best version of themselves, the version that stands tall against corruption, that refuses to be cowed by arrogance, that believes truth is still worth fighting for. And so the story closed not with a single woman's victory, but with collective awakening. It wasn't just that Jasmine Crockett had won her defense. It was that she reminded a nation of something it had nearly forgotten: the power of dignity in the face of arrogance, and the unstoppable strength of truth against corruption. Her words didn't just echo in the chamber. They carried into living rooms, classrooms, workplaces, and hearts. They became a beacon, a reminder that when justice is under siege, the answer is not despair but courage. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all. Because in that moment, Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was defending us all. Judge Richard Leon's face lingered in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. That frozen expression, the stillness of a man who had just watched the entire power dynamic of a courtroom flip in real time, became the silent punctuation mark on the moment. It wasn't just a reaction. It was a testament, a recognition that something extraordinary had unfolded before his eyes. And that's what history will remember. The day arrogance was silenced by truth. In an era where power too often drowns out principle, where noise tries to substitute for substance, Jasmine Crockett reminded us all that dignity and truth still have the power to cut through. Her words, sharp yet steady, did more than defend her name. They defended the very ideals that define justice, democracy, and equality. This wasn't just courtroom drama. It was a moral reckoning. And for everyone who watched, whether from the gallery benches, on a live stream, or to the viral clips that race across social media. The takeaway was clear. Courage in the face of arrogance isn't optional. It's necessary. And now it's your turn. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that one voice can still challenge corruption, if it reignited your belief that truth can prevail, then don't just watch in silence. Be part of the movement. Share this story. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep amplifying voices that matter. Add your voice to a growing chorus that refuses to be ignored. Because sometimes one voice is all it takes to change everything. And tomorrow, that voice could be yours.